Hello everyone, I'm Kusha.
And I'm Rajiv.
And in this week's episode of Policy and Chill, we're going to be discussing GLCs, government-linked companies. So Rajiv, what is a GLC?
Well, a GLC, a government-linked company, can actually come in many forms. Now, the first kind of GLCs, some GLCs are profit motivated GLCs. There are companies that are out there and supposed to make money and are owned by the government. And some GLCs are statutory GLCs that they're supposed to run some form of government function. So basically, these are the two kinds of GLCs that are out there. And the reason we have them could be various, from legacy issues to current desires.
It's okay, no worries. So statutory bodies are created through an act in Parliament, and actually it's a question that I've been wanting to ask you. So as a statutory body, if the body creates resolutions for, let's say, these policies will be such and such, do these regulations get enforced? Or does it depend on the parliamentary act of the body itself? Like, can it enforce anything? Can it create regulations?
Alright, so should we go maybe one step back
Yes.
and talk about how statutories come
Yes.
into being? So, in every ministry, you have a lot of government departments. You know, they do all different kind of functions, and some ministries have less, some ministries have more. But the first kind is a plain old government department, where the conventional government department, maybe sorry to everyone, it's not a plain old, but the conventional government department, where the head of department reports to the minister or reports to the officers in the ministry, who then report to the minister. A statutory body is the modernization of that to some extent, where you have an additional layer of board members, right, that are in between the head of the department, so the head of the statutory body, and the ministry. So these board members are either appointed by the minister, appointed by some cases by the minister, in some cases by the prime minister, in some cases by the king, on advice of the government. And these board members then have a duty as defined by the Act. So the Act will specify who can be a board member. The Act will specify the limits and roles of the statutory body, and basically governs how this body can operate. What are the extents of its powers? What are the limitations of its powers? What are its duties? And it's different from one body to another. So each of them has their own Act of Parliament, and we have to refer to each of the Act of Parliament if you want to know to what extent can say decisions that they be made, what needs to be done. So some bodies can make these decisions and they are applicable straight away.
So like the Energy Commission would be a statutory body?
Yes.
The Suruhanjaya Tenaga?
Correct. Everything with the word Suruhanjaya.
Everything with the word Suruhanjaya?
Yes.
Is a statutory body. Let me try to think of any other things.
Can you think of another one?
SEDA doesn't have Suruhanjaya in its English name, but does it have it in its VM name? Sustainable Energy Development
Authority.
Authority.
It has the word authority. Most of the things.
So the Plot Plan Authority has the word authority.
Yes. Alright. So regardless of what the name is, the name is actually flexible. You can have the name with the word authority, without the word authority. That's not the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter is this body was created by an Act of Parliament. That's the crux of the body that makes them a statutory body.
And it reports to the minister. It does not have anything else to do with the Parliament. The Parliament just creates.
The Parliament creates.
Yeah.
No. The Parliament now has select committees who can check on them. But that's a whole different topic. We'll cover that in another podcast. But because you asked it, I had to. Yeah, but yes, they are answerable to the minister. So now there are some bodies that should be independent, say the MACC, the Election Commission.
Yeah.
These bodies are not independent today. They should be independent. But by and large, most of the statutory bodies should report to their minister, their ministry, because they carry out that government function, and the minister is responsible for what they do. So the board members appointed to these things are answerable to the minister. They are not independent, by the way. So we talk about SEDA and the Energy Commission. This was close to what I did in NASDAQ. But there's so many other authorities. The Langkawi Development Authority, the Port Klang, Port Klang Authority. You've got Pharma. Actually, you know what? Pharma, I'm not sure.
Span
Span
is an authority.
Span is an authority.
Suruhan Jaya.
Perkhidmatan Air Negara.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
Pengurusan Aset Air Berhad,
Yeah.
another authority. So you've got a lot of authorities out there across all the ministries, and these authorities carry out a various government role. And as they carry out a various government role, they are answerable to the minister, which means the board members are not independent and are answerable to the ministers. And this board members can be appointed and dismissed accordingly as what the Act prescribes. Now,
So if a random person, a normal Malaysian civilian who thinks he qualifies to be a board member of a certain authority or has interest to become a board member of a certain authority, is there a direct way to apply? Like, oh, here's my resume, can you consider me for this position? Or is it just entirely up to the minister and the prime minister?
I mean, you can write to the minister if it's the minister's power, and then you can propose your name to the minister.
So unless you're kawan with the minister, there's no way to get into this thing, actually. Because there's no like real selection process. There's no like a transparent way to vet. There's no like standard measures. It's just like, oh, the minister wants this 5 people in, so we put the 5 people in, kind of.
I don't think that's very fair to say of the minister. There may be some cases where a minister may do things like that, but I don't think it's very fair to say that. I mean, it's a similar way in how they choose all the heads of departments of the various other agencies which are not statutory boards. Sometimes they are open interviews, sometimes they are open vacancies that are advertised, and sometimes they are promotions from within, and sometimes people are headhunted to head these positions. So the board members are also in the same boat as the Secretary General of the Ministry, the KSU of the Ministry, isn't it? And other senior, like the Deputy Secretary Generals of the Ministry.
Yeah, but this is like kind of detached from the civil service. Like the civil service kind of has a structure, and people kind of move around in that structure. And yes, there's 1,000 problems with the civil service that we will not address today. But yeah, essentially the statutory body, like they don't become civil servants, part of serving in that body.
Depends what the act says.
So it depends on their Parliament Act. But it's easy and fair enough to conclude that, unless the minister knows you and wants to hire you, you literally cannot be hired.
I would dare venture that half the board members are not personally known to the minister.
Okay.
Sometimes they are recommended by the ministry officers who are assisting the minister to oversee that particular statutory body.
And then the second type of government-linked companies are the profit-making government-linked companies.
But maybe before we go to that, then we have, so you've got the government departments and you've got the statutory bodies doing government functions. But you have also have another category of similar to statutory body, but registered as companies. So they're registered with the Registrar of Companies, the SSM. The reason we do this varies. Sometimes it takes too long to put in Act of Parliament into place. Sometimes the queues to put in new bills in Parliament take a couple of years, and the government just wants to get things moving. So there are some government functions that are being run through an agency, but maybe to avoid certain bureaucratic processes, they are just created as companies.
Like Tourism Selangor.
Yes, like Tourism Selangor, like MGTC, and quite a handful of other agencies. So they are basically performing governmental duties in the area which they are created to do so. Like tourism example, Selangor is to promote tourism within Selangor. They are not for profit. They are not running a business competing with other companies.
They're just executing government policies, but in the capacity
in the form
of a company. Yeah.
So,
So they receive grants from the government.
They may receive grants from the government, or the government may require them to be self-sufficient. Now, see, even statutory bodies, not all of them receive grants. A lot of statutory bodies are self-sufficient financially because in running their duties, they do raise revenue.
Okay.
So, for example, SEDA takes a percentage of all the funds that it manages. So, SEDA receives the 1.6% from the electricity bill, the feed-in tariff, to run the green energy schemes. Now, from the feed-in tariff, 3% goes as administration costs. So the government doesn't pump in money to SEDA. SEDA is
But it takes the money from the revenue that it's
Yes.
regulating. Okay.
and other bodies may have fees prescribed for some of the services that it provides, and it earns a revenue.
So for these companies, like STEDA, how much they are spending, their OPEX will not be reflected on the national budget?
No, it may not be if they are not receiving money from the government. So, for example, the Selangor Library, it's a statutory body created under the Act of the State Assembly, not Parliament.
Because it's a state government.
Yes.
Statutory
So
body.
it receives a portion of its revenue income from its services. When people rent halls in the library, when people pay fines for returning the book late, maybe at some point in the past for membership fees, but now membership fees is free at the Selangor Library. So it receives some of its money from its services. It receives a grant from the state government every year, an amount that may vary from year to year, and it also actually receives a grant from the federal government as well. So that's an example of where the money could come from. So not every statutory body is reliant on the government coffers for its operational expenditure, but some of them are.
And these government bodies are still, the parliamentary special committees can still check on their spending? So
The select committees can check anything they want to check.
Okay. So there's still some amount of check.
And we'll come back to that in another podcast in the podcast on select committees.
Yeah.
I love select committees. Malaysia does not quite have a mature processes in place for select committees, but that's really for another episode. So let's come back to this. So whether it's a government department, whether it's a statutory body created by Act of Parliament, or whether it's in the form of a company, these bodies are out to do government function. So now, why are there politicians on there? To be quite frank, sometimes as alleged by Twitter and general public, it could be to promote an MP, promote a politician without good reason. Yeah. Honestly, this happened. This country has a long history of 60 over years, and things like that have happened in the past, should not happen anymore. All right?
Yeah.
But there are also many legitimate cases where the statutory body is doing very sensitive regulation, and a politician serving on the board serves to help the minister to ensure that this statutory body is governing its area in line with the aspirations of the government.
Aspirations of the government, and also they understand the people's sensitivity.
They understand
so if a government decides to raise tariff of electricity, let's say the Energy Commission decides to raise tariff of electricity, at this moment where we're trying to shrink the cost of living as low as possible, a politician on the board would be helpful when he says that actually it's not in line with our...
So the politician represents the government because he's part of the administration. So he represents the minister in
Minister, Prime Minister, or the king.
The king is appointing based on the advice of the government. So to be practical, he represents the government of the day in the board. So if he's the chairman of the board, he sets the tone. If it's just a board member, which happens also, like I was on the board of SEDA for a couple of years, we have to ensure that the functions, the way the organization functions, is in line with the aspirations of the government.
Okay.
All right, and we are accountable. The minister is accountable for what the board does, and we are accountable to the minister for what the board does.
But actually, I've always wondered. There's always been this fire against politicians being on boards. But I've wondered, people want normal technocrats to be appointed. How will you ever hold them accountable? When they make a wrong decision, a politician will have to face the general election. A government faces a general election, and the government is held accountable. Politicians are constantly held accountable every 5 years. Whether people choose to see it or not, they are being assessed. Essentially, the election is the assessment process, and if you make bad regulations or you make non-people friendly regulations, you will face the consequences during the general election. But appointing a technocrat, any mistakes that they make will not be held truly accountable by the people. So as much as I understand the public outcry about politicians that are simply appointed and are appointed for a promotion or for a paycheck, I understand the public outcry for that.
Rightfully so.
Rightfully so.
I don't support that.
Yeah, neither do I. But I also think there's enough merit to appointing politicians on the board, because who can you truly hold accountable? With your vote, you're holding politicians accountable, but how will you hold a technocrat accountable for decisions that they are making?
So, actually, you can hold the technocrat accountable, because the technocrat appointed to the board must still fall in line with the government policies. These boards are, once again, emphasize not independent boards. MACC and the Election Commission should be independent, but by and large, the 100 over other boards are not independent. Lembaga Kemajuan Ikan Malaysia is not independent. It needs to be accountable to the Minister of Agriculture, needs to fall in line with the Minister of Agriculture, needs to make recommendations to the Minister of Agriculture for the day-to-day runnings, but it is not independent of the government of the day. It is responsible to the government of the day because it is part of the government elected by the people. And as such, if from time to time, politicians may play a very useful role assisting the minister in the minister's duties. The same reason why we have a deputy minister to assist the minister.
Yeah.
Think of it as the chairmen of the boards are also in one way or the other assisting the minister in regulating different spaces of government regulation.
Okay.
And
just
every
basically
board,
ironing out all the fine details before it's put in front of the minister.
yeah, so every board will have meetings monthly or maybe once in 2 months, in the worst case quarterly. Every board has subcommittees of the board that have meetings more regularly. So there are hours and hours of meetings and deliberation that happen at the board level, and that is all the deliberations taken away from the workload of the minister. And having a board can assist the minister tremendously in areas where a lot of policy debate needs to happen, a lot of fine-tuning of aspirations need to be put into detailed guidelines and whatnot. And so they can play a useful role. But
can you share with us some of the fine-tuning you've done in your time in SEDA?
yeah, so in SEDA we had to regulate the 1.6%, that is that the money that is collected from the electricity bills into the fund that is supposed to be used to promote green energy. Now the thing is, how should we best use it? How do we balance between pushing the money in for solar, which is the easiest to implement, but also pushing in the money for mini hydros, biomass and biogas. Now, biogas and biomass have a very important role to play, because if you don't process biogas, that gas from animal farms and from palm oil mills that goes out into the atmosphere is so much more harmful than carbon towards climate change. Yeah. So in order to process that, you need in order to do this biogas plants, you need to be able to understand the industry, to put in place the right ways of awarding these quotas.
So, fun personal question: how many
Yes.
hours did you spend researching every time you have to attend a meeting? Like, are you given a file beforehand? Did you spend many hours dissecting the file that's given to you beforehand?
So SEDA had meetings sometimes monthly, sometimes once in 2 months at the main board level, but there was also special board meetings, committee meetings to also look into that. But outside of these official board meetings, I can't remember how many, but many times I've sat down for hours and hours with the staff of SEDA, debating and going through all this and spending time with the industry, understanding.
Would you
from
do
them.
it again if given a chance?
Yeah, I love being part of governing, and I would do it again if given a chance.
Okay, sorry to digress. Just wondering. Okay.
Yeah, so 2,000 ringgit a month is the SEDA's board member, just in case anyone is wondering. Not to say
It's
like,
not
it's not the
exorbitant.
30,000 that
It's-
some boards
yeah.
may pay out. It's not what 1 MTB is.
Yeah, but did you
Given up
have
for people
fun
who
being
don't
on
do
the
work.
board, researching all of this and putting in all
It's
the
a
hours?
heavy
of work?
responsibility as well. Yes, I did enjoy it. It's fulfilling. It's also I felt it's also a very heavy responsibility. So the policies that then we recommend, some of the policies we had the power to put in place ourselves, and some of them we had to refer to the minister's approval.
Which at that time was UB.
Yes. Right.
Best tech.
And that's how it goes. So when you talk about the company versions of the statutory bodies, they also play the same role, like Tourism Selangor. They also play the same role where there's a board, and they also deliberate a lot of things, like, if you only have this much money to promote tourism, like how best do you do so? And so, having a board to hammer this out rather than just having one CEO or one Ketua Pengarah decide can be very valuable to society.
Yeah.
And there's value in, there is value if the board functions properly. Now, I'm not saying all boards function properly. I understand if you will to cite me 10 examples of boards not functioning properly, because we do have problems, legacy problems of
But those
old
are more
boards.
systemic, structural,
And-
institutional reforms that we have to look at.
I think it's not so much of institutional reforms as in like we need to be able to remove non-performing board members of the past and replace them with
Or even
performing.
reevaluate like what boards do we still need if there are boards overlapping, because there's so
Yeah.
many boards who overlap and then they all kind of are
Not
very
necessarily.
murky.
Not
Okay.
necessarily. Actually, if you're listening and you'd like to leave a comment, tell us which board you think is overlapping. Because actually, not really.
Okay.
Not. I dare to venture to say, not really. Some boards could be merged, but their functions will not be halved by merging. They are carrying out separate functions. So, like SEDA and the Energy Commission could be one big happy family board, but
No, but their duties are very specific. The Energy
very
Commission
specific.
itself
Yes.
like oversees the energy production, the energy distribution.
And to make sure that sufficient focus is given on renewable energy, because the Energy Commission is governing so many other aspects of energy, making sure your transmission lines and the reliability of electricity and whatnot.
And making sure your
But
tariffs are
making sure
affordable.
there's another board that is very focused on making sure that there's sufficient effort given to promotion of green energy.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
that is great. And without that, maybe renewable energy will be much more
Inaccessible.
inaccessible.
And also like lower down in the priority of the energy.
Maybe not,
Yeah.
but possibly. So different boards have different functions. Okay, so then there's another category of GLCs.
This is my favorite.
There
The
is
profit
for
making.
profit
So Pharma is an example.
and many others. So some of them are like in a way hybrid. Like Pharma Niaga carries a purpose for the government, but is actually also for profit. Maybank seems to be very
on its own, but
On
it's
its own
very government linked.
it's owned by the government,
Yeah.
but at the same time, a lot of people perceive it as a private company when they transact. No one walks into Maybank thinking I'm dealing with the government.
Yeah, but they have successfully branded themselves, detaching from the government.
Malaysian Airlines,
Yeah.
and so many others. Now, for-profit GLCs compete with other companies. I think that's the key difference. And so when you say don't put politicians on GLCs, I would say not the first category, which are carrying statutory functions. I think politicians could play a very helpful role in one of those.
Because those are very policy focused, fine tuning of government regulation.
But when
overseeing.
it comes to companies which are competing with the private sector, I know some of our listeners will have the position that they shouldn't exist at all. In a very liberal democracy, they would not exist at all. But in the case of Malaysia and a lot of other countries like Singapore, France, you have government-owned companies which are competing in the private sector, and that's just what it is.
Do you think they have an unfair advantage over other private companies?
It depends on how the government runs its regulation. So now, if the Energy Commission is fair to TNB and other independent power producers which are owned by private companies in, let's say, the bidding of the next power plant that is coming up, then it's okay. Then it's all right. It's fair. It's healthy competition. If the
For the
statutory
listeners
body,
who don't know, TNB is also a for-profit
GLC.
GLC. Yeah.
Yeah, so if the regulator is being biased towards a government-linked company compared to a private-owned company, then that's not very good.
So let's discuss Petronas. The other day you gave me a brilliant idea about Petronas, and I agreed with your idea. But would you like to tell your listeners on your stand of Petronas?
So Petronas carries out two functions. It's also it's by default the owner of all petroleum. It has like it regulates the space of petroleum exploration, but it also is the commercial operator of it. And so it could be in the case of telecom and MCMC, where MCMC is the regulator and telecom is the operator. And so the regulatory functions are taken out of telecom into MCMC, rather than telecom being the regulator and the operator. So the Energy Commission is the regulator and TNB is the operator. And they're both owned by the government.
So Telecom Malaysia, which started like Petronas,
Yes.
who owned the operations
It was
at
Jabatan
first,
Telecom Malaysia once upon a time.
and then as it evolved, as the process evolved, separated its regulation function from its profit-making
Yeah.
function, and the government continues to regulate Telecom
Yeah.
Malaysia alongside all the other providers like
Mm.
Maxis, DG,
Yes.
Celcom. And you're proposing the same thing happens to Petronas.
Why not? It should also happen. I think
Why do you think we should do this?
I would prefer the regulator not also be the operator. The regulator should have the best view for the country, not just
One company?
one company. So it'll be healthy to have especially when you have multiple players, that the regulator is not a player himself.
Okay, alright.
So we own these assets. We derive dividends from these assets. These companies are assets to the government. These companies pay dividends to the government. Hopefully, I know some of them lose money all the time, and we should do something about it. But a healthy amount of them do make a profit, and they do pay dividends to the government, and that ultimately goes back to the people. It's part of the government's revenue income, and it goes back to the people. So that is one way some politicians look at these companies, that this is a way to raise revenue for the government without going and taxing the people directly. Now, if you have a full liberal democracy view on the economy, that there should be no GLCs.
Well, unfortunately, we don't fall on that spectrum.
Yeah, but let's say you say like, all the companies should be privately owned. Sell off all the shares in telecom to the private sector. Sell off all the shares in Maybank to the private sector. The government should not own a single share in any company that is for profit. We could move it towards that direction, but the government then will also not derive any dividends from these businesses.
I was listening to Tunku Kuli's interview, and he was instrumental in the nationalizing of Petronas and ensuring that Petronas becomes a national asset.
Okay.
He figured it out at a golf course, of course.
Okay.
And he was saying how if, let's say, Petronas just became a private company, and if Petronas was given away to the private sectors to develop fairly, what would happen is that Petronas will go ahead and make profit, and people who work in the company will enjoy the profit, the top tier in the company will enjoy the profit, and they will just pay a very small tax that comes to the government. Whereas nationalizing the petrol gave us so much more room and space to continue building our infrastructure at that time. What do you think of this?
So I think it depends on how you want to skin the cat. So let's look at how sand is done in Selangor as in relation to how
Sand mining in Selangor.
Sand mining, correct? As in comparison to how petroleum is
being extracted
by Petronas. Okay, so in Selangor, all the people who mine sand pay a royalty to the land office, and that's how the government derives the revenue from sand mining. Now, there's also GLCs doing sand mining, but whoever who mines the sand pays a royalty to the land office. And so, how Petronas could have been set up is the way it was set up, which is not to say wrong, but maybe wouldn't be my preferred way. But what could be done is it could be a regulatory space where royalty has to be paid. So whether it's Petronas, Shell, Murphy Oil, whoever else, Chevron, or whoever else who extracts the oil from the ground, can extract it, pay a royalty. Royalty could be a fixed amount per barrel or a percentage of revenue of sales, and the balance is the companies.
So do you think the revenue could actually match each other in both these methods?
Yeah, it could exceed. It depends on how you regulate it, but
the revenue to the government, not the revenue of the...
Correct. The revenue to the government could even be more than it's the current way. Now, but this will involve strong regulatory thing. You cannot overtax to the point that you kill the industries.
Correct.
But you also cannot undertax that they make all the profit at the expense of it.
Yeah.
All right. So, for-profit companies are more controversial. I don't think we should put politicians in place for the sake of putting them in place there. Just like I don't feel we should put them in place in the statutory bodies for the sake of putting them in there. I guess the merit argument comes into place far more when it comes to the for-profit, because then the best person to generate profit in that industry should be appointed. So you want a good banker in Maybank rather than having a politician hit Maybank. But if the politician happens to be a good banker, maybe why not?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for listening to us, for joining me and Rajiv in today's episode of government companies. I think we've gotten a good overview, and we've wrapped our head around all the different kind of GLCs that are available. If you have any comments, thoughts, questions, please tweet us, share it in the comment section in YouTube. There's no comment section in Spotify. Remind your friends and family that you can access this podcast in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And if you'd like it to be on another streaming platform, tell us so we can figure out a way to put it on there so you can access it easily. Thank you for listening to us again. Remember to click follow for the podcast.
Bye-bye.